Hi, hey, hello, hi there. Hey, folks, sorry about the late start. This is the PowerShell PS Power Hour. We're going to do a bunch of PowerShell community lightning talks. I really don't want to take up any more time than this. So just let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker today, Joel. Joel, go ahead and take it away. You will have to unmute yourself, though.
I muted myself when I was joining because I didn't want to interrupt the ongoing meeting, supposedly. All right, I am trying to show you here about proxy commands. And proxy commands are a concept that's built into PowerShell in the scripting engine. They're basically wrappers for existing commands, which start with a copy of the parameters of the existing command and invoke each step, like begin, process, and end of the existing command. But it allows you to manually invoke those and sort of tweak it in any sort of way that you can imagine. So as an example here, actually, before I give you the example, what I should say is there are two classes that are involved in this. The first is the class called proxy command, which is this system management.automation.proxy command. And you need this in order to create them because you're going to call the create method off of it. And basically, you're going to need to pass it an existing command. So something like, get command, get child item, and pipe it to anything.
Hey, Joel, can you bump the font up a tiny bit?
More? Yeah, sure. Why not? Actually, I can make this that way, and then we can just go huge. There you go. Good. So what we've done is we've created a file, and you can see the file. Actually, I'm going to open it. Hopefully. And we'll bump up the font of that. Maybe. In very tiny increments. Why is it going so slow? So this is what it generated, right? You see the command block at the top. These are the parameters for get child item, along with the dynamic block, which generates all the, provider specific parameters like -raw for the file system and whatever. And then you get pre-generated begin, process, and end blocks. So the second part of what you need to be aware of in order to use these successfully is the steppable pipeline class, this thing here. Actually, I have here a reminder to show you something, so let me just do that. One of the other things that I want to show you is this class. Get member static and look at get. There are individual commands so that you can generate just part of a command. So for instance, this is what Pester uses to generate the parameter binding for mocks. You can call get commandlet binding, get param block, get dynamic parameter, and stick those all together and get a full parameter without getting, the implementation that you see here in add font with begin and process end. So then the next thing you need to know about is steppable pipeline. And get steppable pipeline is a method you can call on any script block. So you can see, like, if I do this script block, I can do get steppable pipeline, and it will return an object that basically has a begin method and a process method and an end method, and it's disposable. But what that allows you to do is to manually step through and tell it whether or not you want to pass it input on the pipeline and so on. So all of that is taken care of for you by the proxy command generator. The idea is that you will modify this thing in one of several ways. The easiest thing to do, obviously, is to say, well, you know what, I don't want to have this include block here because I would like to add it myself and specify it to be, actually, I want to put it in PS bound parameters. I'll add, what did I say? Include star.ttf because I called this f1. So you can do something like that and done, right? Now when you call this, it's going to give you a list of TTF files in your current directory. If you want to do something actually useful, you would take, if we go, actually, I switched to the wrong tab. You can do, like, as an example, this. So if I take these pinvoke declarations and just stick them anywhere in my file, so that these files, so that the, actually, maybe not there. Let's put them here. Now in my script block, so this is the script block that's going to be stepped through. So I can just add a for each here and do session add font. So now when this runs, it's going to actually install the fonts. And that's the of it. You can do so much more. I encourage you to look on GitHub. The two classes that I mentioned just now are enough. If you search for this method right here, get steppable pipeline on GitHub, and limit your search to PowerShell files, you will find thousands of copies of the same one. Actually, you really will, but you will find dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of examples. Several of them from my code. Like I know, for instance, if you look, I have a tunable SSL validator under my own profile account on GitHub that provides proxy commands for all the web things that allow you to tweak SSL validation. I have a wrapper for where object that I use for doing assertions in GitHub. I mean, in pester tests. Anyway, lots and lots of things that you can do by either, you know, messing with the parameters or messing with the script block, or even in some cases adding code around them. There's a great example that I linked to here, LS Colorize. They modify the script block to turn get child item into color. Anyway, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Joel. Next up, I believe we have Jared.
Yep. Thank you. Let me get out of looking at you. So again, my name is Jared Atkinson. I'm going to be talking about a module that I'm working on called PS Reflect Functions. So in the previous presentation, Joel showed a pinvoke declaration, and so I started off. I'm a security guy, so my job is to find hackers basically, and so I use PowerShell to do that sometimes. And so a lot of times the built-in commandlets are very valuable. Something like listing processes and with all the information that's associated with that is very valuable. But oftentimes I run into situations where the data that I want to collect is not available to me directly from either a PowerShell commandlet or a .NET class that's built in. And so I want to supplement that in some way. You know, I did some Googling when this first came up, and I came across, you know, pinvoke.net, and this is going to, this is kind of like a community-driven site that people would share their pinvoke signatures that they've written for those that aren't, you know, familiar with kind of pinvoke syntax. However, I started doing a little bit more research, and I realized that when you call add type to kind of add the pinvoke class declaration into your current run space, there's actual compilation that's occurring on the system. And so as a forensics guy or like kind of an investigator, kind of creating a bunch of extra files with all these compilation artifacts is something that's probably not ideal in my use case. So Matt Graber, who is one of my colleagues, he also had the same situation, but kind of from the attacker perspective, right? So he does red teaming, pen testing, that kind of thing. And so he doesn't want to be leaving any unnecessary file artifacts all over the place if he can help it. And so he ended up writing a module called PS Reflect. And the cool thing about PS Reflect is it allows you to do similar declarations as pinvoke. So you could declare functions that will call Windows APIs all in memory without the unnecessary compilation of using add type. And so it's really cool, but it's a little bit of a challenge to like kind of get into. And so I was able to start getting used to PS Reflect through conversations with Matt directly. But it's not something that everybody's going to be able to just jump right into. And so what I ended up doing was creating this new kind of secondary project called PS Reflect Functions. And the idea here is it's a library of Windows API calls that are built as PowerShell functions that you can then import into your PowerShell session, and you would immediately have access to all of these functions. And so to kind of show that, so we could just kind of list the different. Sorry, this VM is kind of old, so it's a little full and not super responsive. But these are all of the functions that we've currently defined. And so let's say that you're not super used to doing pinvoke or writing PS Reflect declarations. You can come in straight away, load up PS Reflect functions, and you would immediately have like the create pipe API as a PowerShell function. You have create remote thread, create thread, all kinds of cool stuff that you can just kind of immediately use. And so it's another cool concept is this can be used as a reference when you're writing new PS Reflect declarations. So for instance, one of the things that I've noticed is different libraries tend to have a similar convention for the way that you're supposed to call functions, right? So for instance, ntdll, it has a bunch of functions such as ntclose, ntcreate key, so on and so forth. And they typically will use a similar convention for the way that parameters are passed and output is received, for example. And so what you can do is you can say, okay, ntquery, let's do open key. And you can come in here and we have the PowerShell function. We have the actual like PS or PS Reflect declaration for how it's being passed in. So for instance, nt open key is going to return a uint32. It takes an int pointer as a reference. It's going to take a int32 and then an object's attribute struct, and so as a reference. And so then we can kind of see what the actual kind of logic behind that looks like, and it's going to make it a little bit easier to use. And so as we go through, we said we have this object access attribute struct, and so we come down here inside the structures folder and look for this object attribute struct. And so now we have what that's going to look like. It's going to have a ulong, a handle, a Unicode string, so on and so forth. And we have it declared for PS Reflect here. And so all of this just magically gets imported when you import the module itself. And so one thing that I like, there's tons of use cases for this. Like anything that you can do with Windows APIs, you can basically do using kind of this module, and then of course it's extensible to add new functions to it. But an example might be one of the common things in InfoSec that attackers will do is steal the token of an elevated user. So currently I'm running as, I'm running as this tester user, which is just a local user on my system, but they're an admin, so they have the SE impersonate privilege, so they can impersonate any user on the system. And so maybe what I want to do is check out steal the system token, so I could become the NT Authority system account, and maybe that will give me some sort of access rights that I don't currently have. And so a way to do that would be to, for instance, open process token, and then it's, just like all PowerShell, there's going to be tab completion, and so we give it a process handle. So we can do something like get process name win logon. I happen to know is running as system. Sometimes there can be multiple win logons, and then we're going to pass it the handle. And then
I think we lost your audio there. Can you back up a couple of seconds?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I don't know how that happened, but we'll keep going. So generally speaking, I don't know where I left off, but maybe I want to steal a token from a higher privilege process. And so to do that, I have to be able to read this token, right? And so for instance, the win logon process is running as the system account. I'm currently running as this local user. And so what I can do is I can open the process, open a process handle, and I can start to query that. So we have this token, so $H token, and this is just going to be a pointer to the token. So just, an int pointer. And then I could do like get token information, which is another Windows API, and pass it in the token handle, and then ask for all kinds of different types of information. So I'm specifically interested in the token user. And so we see that this token that I've got a reference to from when logged on is now running as the NT authority system account. And so let's say I want to take over that, account. I can do, for instance, open process again. And this time I'm going to call token duplicate. So again, H token, we have a new token handle, and we can now duplicate that token. Destination level. H dupe token. And then we could do impersonate logged on user. And so I give it the duplicate handle or duplicate token. And then I run that. And so now I've successfully impersonated the NT authority system user. And so you may ask how I lost again.
Oh no, 2 minutes.
Okay, cool. Yep. And you may ask how I know that. So let's go check my identity. And we could do get current. And this is telling me who I currently am running as. And we see that I'm running as this NT authority system user account. So that's just one example. And the reason why, this example may not be relevant to many of the people that are watching, but the reason why I like to show this one is because it's very easy to kind of follow, right? So to achieve my objective, I ended up calling open process token, which is a Windows API, get token information, duplicate token, impersonate logged on user, all of which I don't know the arguments to off the top of my head, but I was able to use this kind of the features within PowerShell with like tab completion and all that kind of stuff to be able to easily understand, what each one of these functions needs. And all of this happened in memory without causing any, unnecessary compilation artifacts. And so from there, another example would be revert to self. And so if I run that, now I'm back to this tester user, right? And so just kind of cool examples of what you can do. There's within the repo, the PS Reflect Functions repo, there's probably like 10 or 15 different examples of how you can use this. Most of them are probably geared towards security-centric kind of concepts, but certainly open to anybody doing anything they want with the repo. One of the big pushes is to try to get as much coverage of the different APIs as possible, so that people that aren't necessarily inclined to write their own declarations can just show up, download the module, install it, or import it, and then automatically have all the functions. Cool. Yep. So that's all I have to show, and appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you so much. Okay, next up is Nate.
All right. Hey guys, my name is Nate Farrell. I am a systems and DevOps engineer focusing a lot on AWS and doing a bunch of cool stuff with PowerShell. I'm also the developer of a PowerShell module called VaporShell, which is kind of driven around building CloudFormation templates. So outside of that, the main purpose that I built this is to kind of abstract working with JSON or YAML, and also wanted to leverage a lot of the built-in capabilities that PowerShell comes with. So using VaporShell kind of gives you a lot of benefits with creating templates over just building them in JSON or YAML, including native PowerShell stuff, IntelliSense, tab completion, familiar PowerShell syntax. I'm from a PowerShell background. JSON's pretty easy. YAML's a bit more of a pain, but this is like being able to create templates dynamically was a big thing for me. VaporShell also gives you the ability to do full stack management, meaning getting stack status, deploying new stacks, creating change sets, and also do a couple cool things like packaging. If you're working on serverless apps, that'll upload things to S3, stuff like that. It also supports native shared configuration, so we'll be demoing that here. But that just means we can build a config file that we can apply and kind of give it different environment specific configs underneath. Also, the biggest thing, you no longer have to work with JSON or YAML. So today, in this quick demo, I'm going to be building a CloudFormation stack containing the following resources: an S3 bucket, the policy for that bucket, an EC2 role, an instance profile referencing that role, a launch configuration, an auto-scaling group with that launch config, an elastic load balancer, and a custom resource to basically add the ELB to DNS using Lambda. If we're going to be deploying to production, we can also dynamically add the notification config so that when the auto-scaling group scales up or down, we can trigger an SNS notification, as well as an SNS topic specific to those auto-scaling events so that our production monitoring systems can add or remove hosts as needed. Let's get into it. So this is the full stack, at least the main stack script. Let's step through it. First things first, with anything we want to be dynamic, we're probably going to want to parameterize it. Most of the meat is going to be on this config.psd1. And we're going to say that we're defaulting to our dev environment so we don't accidentally trigger off a production build. As usual, we're going to import our module. And then we're going to import our config at the config path with the specific key. Those configs are basically a big hash table, PowerShell manifest, if you will, containing environment-specific keys with kind of the environment-specific configuration underneath them. After that, the main thing we want to do at the top of any Vapor Shell script is initialize our template object. That's going to give us some really useful things like being able to validate the template from a script method on that object, to adding resources, mappings, outputs, things like that. This is also going to be imported at the global level, since we're going to leverage it to add resources to it from scripts that this calls below. Within our config, we have a hash table of tags, basically tag keys with their appropriate values. CloudFormation has a specific tag format. It's basically a dictionary that, or an array of objects with a key, the value for that key, and then the value for the tag, and so on. Next, we'll create our S3 bucket. We actually have this in a standardized script. That script itself is also parameterized, and that just builds out some simple things that we'll see later. And then the output of that script, we'll just add those to our template. Next up is what I wanted to show you is this add user data helper command. So user data files typically have tags on the top and bottom. For PowerShell, it gets with PowerShell in the middle. But working with a file like that, it kind of breaks PowerShell syntax. So you kind of miss errors that you would normally see if you're working in an editor like Visual Studio Code. So this has a lot of helper things that can recognize the file type, add the appropriate tags if they're not present, and do a couple other things. We're going to leverage this use join param, which will give you a list of the user data file so it's readable when you look at the template. The replace parameter is also going to give us the ability to do string replacement on that user data script to also make that user data script pretty generic as well. So we're going to look for this stack name tag and replace it with the value from the config. Region, we'll replace it with our region, kind of removing the last character from our first availability zone. Next up is the auto-scaling group. So this actually that kind of relates to that auto-scaling group. So this is the big one. This adds things like the auto-scaling group itself, the load balancer, launch config, the EC2 role. If we're doing an S3 bucket, it'll add the bucket policy. It'll add the custom resources that add that elastic load balancer to DNS, things like that. We'll show you that in 1 second. And then if we're going to be deploying to production, we'll also add things specific to that environment that we don't deploy with lower environments. In this instance, we want to save that template file locally just for our own reference later. That could be auditing, that could be anything like that. It could just be source control. Output it to YAML. This uses AWS's CFN flip to convert it from JSON to YAML. I'm using that instead of a YAML library since it's just much more accurate to work with. They recognize the special functions that AWS has for CloudFormation, and they handle them appropriately. And finally, we are going to validate the template syntax and deploy it as either a new stack or a change set if the stack already exists. So this validation will actually throw an error if it doesn't validate. It uses the AWS CloudFormation SDK to perform that validation. It'll tell you if you need to add additional capabilities like named IAM capabilities if you're deploying roles, things like that. Then we will check to see if that stack exists. This will throw a terminating error if it does not. If it passes, we know it exists, and we'll deploy a change set. Otherwise, we'll deploy a brand new stack. So I'll get into the scripts that are kind of called from that. This is the entire S3 bucket script. S3 buckets are pretty straightforward. Usually you get more into the actual bucket policies, which in our instance, we attach to the EC2 role. So this is pretty generic. You can probably just call this script from anything you're working on, and if you need an S3 bucket. Thank you. And then the auto scaling group script is a bit bigger. So I'm going to just run through this really quick. Again, it's parameterized. We pass in our user data from the main script that calls it, our tags, and the S3 bucket name if it exists. We can give it our policy, which will end up attaching to our EC2 role. If we decide to say, hey, this stack is going to have an S3 bucket, this not auto scaling group can get and list buckets. In our instance, this is a web server. I'm going to be able to look at assets from S3 within that new bucket. Next up, we will add in the IAM role for that EC2 role. We'll create an instance profile referencing that role. We'll create an S3 bucket policy if we passed in a bucket name to the calling script. If we are deploying to production, so if our config value environment is PRD, we're going to add that SNS topic. We'll add in some auto scaling group notifications to basically say whenever this thing creates new instances or terminates instances, we're going to notify our monitoring setup so that way we can add and remove hosts for monitoring. That way we're not getting a bunch from an instance being terminated.
About 30 seconds.
All right. Finally, we're going to add in a host template, which is just basically creates a standardized template in our monitoring environment. We'll add in our load balancer, the launch config for our auto scaling group, the auto scaling group itself, and then we're going to add in a custom resource so that the DNS entry for that can get added to our local DNS. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for your time. Next up, we have Stephen. You also need to unmute yourself.
There we go. That's better. All right, so I want to talk about implicit remoting, which can be pretty handy to have in your back pocket. I'm not sure how prevalent it is out there in the wild, but I figured since I have the platform, I will talk about it. So basically what implicit remoting does is it takes a module from a remote computer and copies that module over to your local session. It creates pointers, basically a folder inside of the modules folder with shortcuts pointed at the module on the remote computer that you are trying to interact with. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a session to the remote computer that holds the module that we want to use. So we'll just create a really quick session.
Might be worth bumping the font like 1 or 2.
1 or 2? Okay. We'll just bump it real big. There we go. DC. All right, now that we have the session created, PowerShell's running over on that side, and we can then connect to that session and tell it to import the module. We're going to work with the Windows Update module. Actually, let me center this on my screen a little bit better. I'll close my session. Because I have a typo. There we go. And we'll just check and make sure that the module is loaded. Okay. There they are. Okay, so now that we've verified that our module is loaded in the remote session, we'll go ahead and import that session back. And here's one of the gotchas of implicit remoting. If you have modules loaded locally in your session, it will overwrite the aliases and things like that coming from the remote session, since they're loaded by default there too. This is all stuff that's in PowerShell by default, at least on my system, and they're loaded by default when PowerShell runs on the remote system as well. So they get overwritten. And then it also, you can see here that we have a new script module called this temp name, and then all of the different commandlets that were in the module that got imported as well. One thing that you can do also with import PS session that's kind of handy when you're doing implicit remoting is using the prefix commandlet. And what that'll do is add this prefix. Well, we can say demo for this example. It will add demo to the front of all of the imported commandlets. So for example, that add W service manager will become add demo W service manager. It just gives you a quick way to denote that something is happening on the remote machine as opposed to the local machine. Since I didn't use a prefix in this example, if I run git W settings, for example, this is running remotely against the DC, and since my VMs are rather intense for this little surface that I'm running on this evening, things are kind of slow. There we go. So you can see I have the auto updates on my DC set to notify before installation. You'll notice that it comes back as an object. Another one, and this is kind of a big gotcha for implicit remoting. If you're using commandlets that have methods tied to them, specifically, well, particularly like WMI methods or any other commandlet that has methods attached to it, those will not work with implicit remoting due to the nature of deserializing the data before it comes across the wire. Well, deserializing and reserializing as it comes across the wire, rather. How remoting transfers that data when you're implicitly remoting is it converts it to XML. and then it serializes it back into an object in your local session and presents it to you. And as part of that process, methods get destroyed. So you could, in theory, if you wanted to, rehydrate and make those methods available again. That's a whole lot of work, and you probably don't want to mess with it. But that is one of the big gotchas with this, is losing part of the functionality of the commandlets when you're doing it. Another one of the big gotchas with remoting is if you've got a module loaded locally that doesn't have, say, a computer name parameter or something like that that you can instantiate remote calls against, and you use implicit remoting because it's installed on the other side as well, you'd be better off to run it, just invoke command, load the module, and just not import it back. But if you happen to import it back, what you'll get is a bunch of proxy commands instead. So if you've got a binary module with a bunch of commandlets and you implicitly remote the same module and look at that one, you'll have a bunch of functions. And the nature of PowerShell is to run functions ahead of commandlets if they happen to have the same name.
About 2 minutes left.
If you accidentally, run one of those functions that's implicitly remoted from the remote machine and you're expecting the commandlet to be the one that runs, you'll be sadly disappointed when you get the remote function firing off instead of the local commandlet to return data to you. It's pretty easy, as you can see, to get all this working. You just have to remember there's 3 things that you need to make this work. First, you need your session. Then you need to import your module in that session. Remember to import your module in the session. And then the third thing is to import that session back locally. Those are the 3 steps you need to take for implicit remoting to work. It's pretty easy to get it going. It can be a tad confusing if you forget one of the steps.
About 30 seconds.
And always remember when you're done to get PS session, and you can list them, pipe that to remove PS session to clean everything up, and that will destroy the pointers to the module on the remote side. And you're back to just local sessions. And that's all.
Hey, thank you so much for your time, Stephen. Next up is Francisco.
Hey there, my name is Francisco Navarro. So the only PowerShell you'll see from me today is a PS Core console to SSH into a Linux workstation. So let's get started. So today I plan on demonstrating how you can deploy a multi-container or quote-unquote service application using Docker Compose on Linux. So I'm going to go ahead and SSH into my machine. And next, we're going to go ahead and validate that I am on a Linux distro and the version of Docker that I already have installed on that machine. So I'm going to type in sudo docker info. The sudo thing is going to kill me here, but okay. So here we're running a Fedora 28 workstation, and as you can see here, we're running Docker Community Edition version 1806. So now moving on, we're going to go ahead and install Docker Compose. I wanted to showcase that, so it's fairly simple and quick. We're going to sudo curl the location of our Docker Compose binary. We're going to be using 1.22, and we're going to drop it into user local bin Docker compose. So let's just go ahead and hit enter to that. And let's go ahead and validate that our binary is there. So let's go ahead and sudo ls into that location, and our binary is there. Now let's go ahead and ensure that the binary is executable. Sudo shymod, and there we go. Now let's validate that Docker Compose actually works. This does not require a elevated prompt here. So we are running Docker Compose, and again, 1.22. Okay, so with Compose, you use a YAML file to define the services or containers that make up an application. So we're going to go ahead and create a WordPress application, and I'm going to show you that we already have a directory here that we're going to be working with. It's called WordPress. And let's go validate that we do have a YAML file already there. Then I'm in big trouble. And we do. So, and just another note, with Docker Compose, you can use either YML or the full YAML extension. So they both work. You'll see that I'm going to reference the directory and the name of the YAML file. It used to be where that Docker Compose, you'd have to run that inside of the directory where you have your YAML file. I'm going to use this new flag, which is F, which allows us to do two things. Again, work with a YAML file that's in a different directory from where we're running Docker Compose, and also allows us to use a different name than Docker-Compose onto the YAML file, because Docker Compose is actually looking for that title. But again, the -f allows us to work with again, different directory, different name. So before I get started and actually run anything with this YAML file, let's dissect the YAML file. It's very important because this YAML file is going to build our application, right? So we're going to start off with a few crucial keys. The version key at the very top is mandatory, and it's always the first line at the root of the file. It defines a version of the Compose file format and what API you're calling within Docker. So I'm going to use the latest, which is 3.7. And you can reference the Docker documentation as to which one you should use, depending on what application you're deploying. The other key here is services. Essentially, services is allowing us to define our application. And I'm going to break it down here. I have two services or two containers that I'm going to build. One is going to be a database, and the other is going to run the actual binaries for WordPress. So let me go ahead and break this down. After we create these keys here, or these parameters, we could actually name them whatever we want. I decided to use an example that's out there. So we're using DB as the name of the database container and WordPress as the name of the WordPress container. We're going to go ahead and then provide another parameter underneath as to what image we're going to use, what Docker image we're going to use. You can build your own Docker image within the YAML file, but I decided to go ahead and use the example. We're going to go ahead and just pull down a MySQL image that's version 5.7. The next parameter is, describes the database, right? The actual volume of where MySQL is going to write, anything that needs to write either from WordPress or from itself. And so we're going to give it the name of db_data. And inside the container, we're going to traverse the data into var lib MySQL. The other parameter that we have here is restart. So if the Docker daemon has to restart or the actual host OS has to restart, we're going to add this parameter here so that this service or this container also restarts when that occurs. Another parameter here is the environment. So we're going to set up MySQL root password, MySQL database, name and also the user name and password to that database. So moving on to our other container, which is WordPress, it'll have similar parameters here. And essentially, WordPress will depend on this container to be running, right? So before WordPress can run, we need that other container to run. So that's what depends on essentially is for. And then the image, again, we're going to go pull down WordPress and the latest version that's out there in the Docker Hub. Then we're going to specify ports because we need to communicate with this container where both of these containers talk to each other within an internal networking. If you want to expose the WordPress web page, you have to specify the port. So normally WordPress uses port 80, but we're going to expose that port 80 into 8000 on our physical machine or browser. We're also going to give it a parameter of restart always. And we're also going to set some environment variables here. Again, the WordPress database, that's essentially the DB container, and it's going to communicate with it on the port of 3306. We're also going to provide the WordPress database username and password, which again is identical to the MySQL username and password.
About 2 minutes.
Okay, and then we're going to also tell WordPress that we're going to set all this data in this particular volume here, which is db_data, and again we specify that up here. Okay, so moving on, let's go ahead and begin to run our build. So we're going to run Docker compose build so that we can validate that our YAML file has no errors. And as you can see, there's no errors, and it skips doing anything with pulling down any images because I already have the images pre-downloaded so that we don't have to wait for that. And the way we see that is sudo docker image ls all, and you'll see here that we have those images downloaded. Okay, now let's go ahead and run our containers or build our containers with Docker Compose. We're going to go ahead and run this command. Let's clear all this here. I'm going to type in sudo docker compose, again, the location of the YAML file, and then up.
About 30 seconds.
And that's deploying the actual containers. What's going on here, you're going to get verbose information, and the containers will continue running in the background as long as you don't cancel out of this verbose logging. If I have a moment here, I'll show you that with a small flag, you can run those containers in the background after you cancel out, because what's going to happen when you cancel out, it's going to stop those containers. So I'm just going to go ahead and see if I can run this last stitch.
I think that's time.
That time? Okay. -D will keep your containers running in the background. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Next up, and the last person for tonight, is Thomas.
Howdy. You guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Sweet. So my name is Thomas Rainer. I'm a senior security services engineer at Microsoft, and I'm currently sitting in building 92, which, if you've been here, you know is not a quiet building. So apologies in advance if there's any interference. And I'm going to teach you how to make Visual Studio Team Services, or now as it's known, Azure DevOps extension in 10 minutes or less, or Michael and Warren will refund all your money. And so I'm in Visual Studio Code first, and you can see my folder structure here. I'm just in a folder called 10-minute extension, and I've got a few files here already prepared because there's no way I could do this in 10 minutes otherwise. And you'll notice I've got a README file here. We'll come back to that, as well as an icon.png file. We'll come back to that as well. And then what these extensions are really made up of when you're writing them in PowerShell is a JSON file that describes the extension as a whole, and then folders for each of the different tasks that exist in your extension. And so we're going to be building a build extension today, and I'll show you how to do that. First, the manifest for the entire extension is just sitting in the root of the folder. I've named mine 10min-extension.json. And a lot of this is kind of boilerplate that you can take from a tutorial or you take from an existing example. And it's reasonably self-explanatory. It gets an ID, it gets a version that allows you to keep track of what you're doing, and a name, a description, nothing really mind-blowing yet. You can give this a category. Most might end up in code, but you can categorize them differently as per the guidelines on the marketplace that we'll look at in a moment. This publisher is actually a unique string. That's not just an alias that I like to use. I've registered this with the Visual Studio Marketplace, and I'll show you where you can do that. What services am I targeting? I'm targeting the Visual Studio Team Services. You can provide tags for your extension. If you've looked through the marketplace at all, you've seen that you can tag them. And here's where I specify the icon for my extension, and it's just sitting in the root of the folder. And here's where I specify the content that's going to show up when you browse and find my extension in the marketplace. My README file is pretty simple. Below the content for the README file, you need a section for it. I'm just trying to scroll without going too far. For contributions, this is an array of all of the different tasks that are inside of your extension. And so I'm only writing one task today, and it's going to be called get some, and it's a task. The properties' name is get some. And then in this files section, we specify the folders that are going to hold all of our different extensions themselves. So usually when you're going and writing one of these, you're honestly borrowing one from the last one you wrote. You're going and you're changing the ID and the version and the name and the demo in the description, and then leaving a lot of it the same, and then coming and editing your paths in your contributions and files. And so it looks like a lot of JSON, and it is, but it's not horrendously complicated to figure out how it works. So in this files, I've specified the folder path getsome. You can see it on the side here. In the getsome folder, this is all the files from my task. And if I had multiple tasks in this extension, I would have multiple folders at the same level as the manifest that I just showed you. In the getsome folder, I've got a PS modules folder. And in there, I've got, I'll just make that smaller, the VSTS task SDK. You can download that from their GitHub. It's also available in a few places online. And you don't necessarily have to change that either, other than to update it. And I'll show you a couple of reasons why you want to include that module when you're building your extension, building your task. The task itself has a PowerShell file and a task.json that describes the task itself. And so let's jump into that. The task.json gets a GUID, unique identifier. Make sure you don't forget to change that. A name, and then a friendly name, which will describe how it shows up in the list of tasks that you have available to you. A description that describes the task. What kind of task are you building? A build extension, or sorry, a build task or a release task or some other kind of task. Whether you can see this step in builds or releases, or just builds or just releases. What it's able to run on. Maybe it needs to run on a specific type of deployment group. I've got some author information and version information for the task. I've got the instance name format. Remember, I made this very unique, so you'll see exactly where it pops up, because this is usually of concern for people. The type of groups that it's in, and then inputs. So you can provide input to a VSTS build or release task as it's being configured. And in this situation, I'm configuring a variable called user input, and it is a string. You can make file paths here. You can make a whole bunch of different types of inputs that we don't have time to look at, but you can make radio buttons and drop downs, and you can adjust the visibility of these based on what one of the drop downs is set to. There's really good documents describing all of this. And I'm just giving it a label of what you have to say, and then some markdown and the fact that it's a part. And then the execution section will describe what is being run. So this task has a whole bunch of metadata already in it for what the type of inputs are and what's going to happen to it. And then what's actually going to be run as code. PowerShell.ps1, the file that I've got here, should run on Windows, and the current working directory will be working directory. So this PowerShell.ps1 file gets run. What does that file do? It takes no parameters really. This trace VSTS entering invocation is part of what's in that SDK that you're going to want to include, and it just provides some helpful information as you're running the task. Then I'm going to write host retrieving parameters passed by VSTS. And this get VSTS input is a make that a little is a part of that module as well. And I'm going to go get the user input thing that I described in this task.json. This is that user input variable that I'm retrieving, and I'm assigning it to user input. And then I'm just going to write host user input. If I can't get that for some reason, I'm going to throw an error, and then I'm going to be done my invocation. So I want to do the VSTS leaving invocation command. So once I have this all figured out, first you'll want to go to node.js.org and download the latest version of Node. And then you'll want to install, using npm install, this tfx-cli. And then what you can do is run this handy tfx command to basically parse all of that stuff that we made and create a file that you can upload into the marketplace. So I run that, and it takes an excruciating amount of time when we're actually on a time crunch here. And you can see I got some output. My extension version is 003. My publisher is me. And then if I hop into my browser, go to marketplace.visualstudio.com and click on Publish Extensions. If you've never done it before, it'll walk you through setting up your publisher, and that's where you get that string that I showed you earlier. And then you can come and manage your publishers and extensions. If you want to make a new extension, you click here. And for VSTS, now it's called Azure DevOps, you go there. And when you click that, it asks you to upload the artifact that we just created in the command line, or you can click on one that you've already created and update it.
About 2 minutes.
I'm going to do that because I've already done that here. This is the working directory for my folder. This is the output of that command that I ran. I'll click that and drag it here and click upload, and it will upload version 003. And you can see it's verifying. If you're not a trusted publisher, you're going to have to go in here and share your extension specifically with a VSTS Azure DevOps organization. So I've done that. I've shared it with my demo organization already. You can see it's here. You click on it, and it takes forever to load because I'm on public Wi-Fi. And you can see the content of my readme.markdown. You can see the tag that I gave it, the categories, the version here, and I can click on Get It Free because I'm not charging for this. It will ask me which organization I want to put it in. I've got a couple, so I'm just going to install it into the one that I'm looking at. Takes forever when you're waiting for it. You're all set. Now I can go into one of my pipelines. This is a build pipeline, and I'll refresh the tasks that I've got available right here. And I've got my Thomas Rayner Get You Some, so I'm going to add that. And you can see here, this is where it says do some biz for real. That was that unique value that I put there. Here's the input, the user input field that I've got. So hello, folks. I'm just going to put that. I can change what this says because it's my step. If I want to
About 30 seconds.
look at the help, that's where that all came together. And then I'm going to save and queue this. Save and queue. And my build number 129 is currently running, and this is going to take forever. Very quickly, come on. Agent running. Initialize, check out the branch. Come on. We're so close. Ever so close. Come on. Go, 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 go. There, it's executing my step. And so there, my build has finished. If I go and I look on the output of my step, I've got the retrieving parameters and the value that I passed in being written out to the command line. So that is the crash course in how to build and deploy a VSTS, or now an Azure DevOps build and release extension. Obviously, it's very boilerplate and basic, but you can kind of build on that and go from there. It's not very hard to get started, but there is definitely a lot as you go and wish to master it. So thanks very much for having me on, and that's all I've got.
Yep, thank you so much. Okay, that is the last of our presentations. And we have a couple of quick announcement things. So Warren, you want to go first?
I guess I'll mute myself. Sorry about that. Brandon couldn't make it, so his bit on ChatOps, Ploshbot, and Microsoft Teams is going to come up later. Definitely check that out. I have a few things to pester you with. First off, we're always looking for folks to do demos for this PowerHour thing. It's a really low-stress way to show something fun. If you find something useful, chances are someone else will. So it's kind of handy for other people. And it's kind of a good way to get started publicly speaking. You don't have to like prepare a whole 45-minute bit or a 90-minute bit and be up on stage in front of a big audience. It's just kind of a good way to get started. So anyways, I'll include a link later, but it's just GitHub, PS PowerHour, PS PowerHour. And if you want to share even more than that, there's the PowerShell and DevOps Global Summit coming up. And the CFP for that closes October 1st. So if you have some ideas on something fun to submit, and chances are, don't like scare yourself out of this. There's a conferences room in the PowerShell Slack team. Do bit.ly/PS Slack if you don't have an invite there. And you can get some feedback on your ideas. If you've never submitted an abstract, you can kind of get some feedback on what might be worth including. And don't be scared of submitting a proposal. It's really pretty straightforward. There were a lot of first-time speakers last year, and a lot of them really knocked it out of the park. So do consider submitting that. And I think that's pretty much it. The links to all the things I just mentioned are at bit.ly/2019CFP if you want to see them. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to hand it off to Michael, who has like one more thing to share, two more things.
Yeah, sure. So kind of following up on what Warren just talked about, one of the things to keep in mind is that if you want to submit a proposal for these lightning talks and you're not sure what you want to propose on, hit either of us up at any time. We're totally happy to walk through an idea with you, talk you through it, get it in, get it submitted. I don't think we've turned down a single proposal so far. I think all of them have come along and been really good and really worth sharing. I promise you, if you're paying attention to this at all today, you have something to share, and the community would be better for it. So a couple other things to kind of keep in mind. If you're watching this, you may also be interested in a conference that's coming up called Chocolatey Fest or WinOps San Francisco. So this is a Windows DevOps conference. It's a one-day conference. You can find it by Googling for Chocolatey Fest. And I think it might also be chocolatyfest.com. And then the second thing is, if you enjoy this content, it's really, really likely that you'll enjoy the PowerShell conference book, which is written by a bunch of speakers from the DevOps Summit for the last couple of years. And there's a chapter per speaker. There's about 30 to 35 chapters. I think there's 33. Each is a completely different chapter, deep dive, as much content as you would normally get in a full session at the summit. You can find that on LeanPub, and you can find that now in hard copy on Amazon. And actually, speaking of hard copies, looks like Nate is actually holding up a hard copy. So you can find it on LeanPub or on Amazon if you want to get the hard copy. Digital copy is only through LeanPub, though. And it's important to note that all of the proceeds for that, all of them, every single penny that we make from the sale of those books, digital and physical, goes back to funding the On-Ramp program, which is a scholarship, scholarships for the On-Ramp program, rather, for the DevOps and PowerShell Summit. So the way that works is it's going to guarantee that people can go free of cost, covers their travel, covers the hotel, covers their ticket, and gets them in so they can get started in doing IT operations in our industry, and specifically around Windows operations. So I think that's a pretty neat thing that we've got going on as a community. We don't have the next one of these scheduled. Warren and I are discussing how we want to do scheduling going forward. We're probably going to slow up the pace. We know we've been kind of burning y'all up, asking for a submission every week or so. So we're going to kind of slow down a little bit, but we want to get more of those submissions in. And if we have too many submissions that monthly feels like they're just kind of piling up, we'll probably look to do it a little more frequently. So if you want more of this, you got to submit talks. The content comes from you. So I think that's all we have. Warren, is there anything else?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Awesome. So thank you all so much for coming out, for paying attention, for listening to folks share their information and their stories with us tonight. We're really looking forward to doing this again. We will have more information on that to follow. Have a good one.